Rosofsky, Tom Callahan, Linda Champion is coming shortly, and Julie Kramer. What did I just say?
Jeff.
Oh, Jeff, sorry. Oh my goodness. So I'm going to turn it over to Robert. He's going to walk you guys through the agenda, do some other formal introductions for our guest speakers, and he'll give you a little bit of context as to why we joined forces with the Milton Housing Coalition.
Thank you, Danya. I was multitasking, handling AV equipment here. My name is Robert Rosofsky. I'm with Affordable Inclusive Milton. And we're very glad that you're all here. We've joined forces with the Milton Housing Coalition to share details and answer questions on the new MBTA Communities Act and its multifamily zoning requirements. It's a new state law that requires our town's compliance under punishment of not being able to obtain certain state funds. And our goal here is to advocate for including affordability requirements as part of this development. So I want to start by introducing our first speaker, who is Dana LeWinter. Dana previously worked as the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Community and Banking Council, and she served as the Housing Director for the City of Somerville. She worked for CHAPA, Citizens Housing and Planning Association from 2009 to 2011 as a program manager working on 40B and home ownership collaborative programs. Dana returned to CHAPA in 2018, and she serves now as the Municipal Engagement Director. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from Brandeis University and a Master's in Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning from Tufts University. Please welcome Dana LeWinter.
Wonderful. Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. So, as Robert said, I'm Dana LeWinter. I'm the Director of Municipal Engagement at CHAPA, and I'm going to give you an overview of the multifamily zoning for MBTA communities regulation, or Chapter 3A, Section 3A, sorry, as it's also called. Just briefly, a little bit about CHAPA, and I'm also joined here by my colleague Whitney Demetrius, who's been working with folks in Milton. She is our Director of Fair Housing Engagement and also works on our Municipal Engagement program. And CHAPA is a statewide organization, stands for Citizens Housing and Planning Association. A little louder. Okay. It is hard to get much closer to this. But I will speak up. Can folks hear me now? Okay, great. Our mission, you can see here, is to encourage the production and preservation of housing for people who are low and moderate income. We've been around for more than 50 years, and we were founded in the civil rights movement. And so over the course of that time, we've borne witness to the causes and effects of exclusionary housing policies. And so due to that history and that understanding, we really aim to focus our framework on equity and access as a call to action. So all the work that we do, you may know us from our work on first-time homebuyer efforts. You have seen we monitor 40B developments. We do a lot of policy at the state and federal level, and we do our municipal engagement initiative. But all of it comes from that mission and that understanding. And we believe that Massachusetts should be a place where our communities nourish us and help us to grow. And we believe right now that housing is the single best investment every community can make to create the future that we all want and deserve. And part of that is creating a diverse mix of homes in every part of Massachusetts. You can see some of the benefits that we believe affordable housing and housing opportunity bring to our communities. And more importantly, we understand that the benefits of providing ample affordable housing and the consequences of not permeate the whole community, not just the individual or the household who happens to live in that home. These are benefits that extend to our whole community. So it's about our environment, our health, our children's education, our economy, and wealth building, in addition to just providing a really important need and right of having a safe, affordable home built in your head. So we're here tonight to talk about the multifamily zoning for MBTA communities regulation. You can see all of the communities that are covered under this regulation. This is the most significant change to zoning in more than 40 years in Massachusetts, and it will make it possible to create the homes that people need. It will help us to support local businesses, reduce car dependency, stabilize rents, and home prices that have been rising faster than people's incomes. I know you all see that every day. It applies to these 175 cities and towns that are served by the MBTA, so you're in good company. This is not just Milton that is going to be compliant. It's probably no surprise to you, Massachusetts has among the highest costs in the nation for housing, and we've also had significantly less multifamily housing production over the last few decades than we need to meet the demand. And as a result, people are being priced out, communities are becoming more homogenous, people are driving further to afford a place to live, putting more cars on our road, and it's leading our region to be less economically advantaged, or reducing our economic competitiveness. So before I go into the regulation itself, I want to talk a little bit about why multifamily housing near transit is so important. These are a couple of ways that people think about this type of development. You might hear of it described as a 15-minute neighborhood or a 20-minute neighborhood, a walkable community, a transit-oriented community. All of those are the types of communities that people are striving to create, and the why is because we understand that our zoning, our lack of zoning, for multifamily housing is creating a barrier to new development and affordability in Massachusetts, and the benefits of creating communities that fit this framework are really broad. So there are all of the benefits I'm going to talk about here. I want to say there are studies, plenty of studies to support this, and I'm happy to share those with any of you who are interested. There are climate benefits. When we reduce our car dependency, we have lower emissions, we have better outcomes for our climate. There are wealth benefits, so walkability and proximity to transit is positively correlated with assessed values, and also those more walkable transit-oriented communities outperform car-centered communities when we're talking economic benefits. There are health benefits. Obviously, there are benefits of walking more in your daily life, but also when more people are not in cars, we have fewer traffic deaths, and it also reduces illnesses such as asthma and heart disease. There's equity benefits, so walkable and transit-accessible communities are more equitable for people who simply cannot or don't want to drive. It provides autonomy for young and old residents. And lastly, there's community benefits. There's research showing that walkable communities build social capital because people make those connections more strongly with their neighbors. So this is the why. We just haven't been doing this enough in Massachusetts, and so this new regulation will allow us to do it. We also want to talk about what is multifamily housing. Under Massachusetts General Law 40A, which is our zoning code, multifamily housing is defined as a building with 3 or more residential dwelling units, or 2 or more buildings on the same lot with more than 1 residential unit in each building. And that can look like a lot of different things. So you see here this image of missing middle housing. Any of that would be multifamily housing. So it's anything from duplexes to fourplexes, triple deckers, which is a really common housing type here in Massachusetts, townhouses, stacked homes, live, work, cottage courts or courtyard buildings. All of those qualify as multifamily housing. I think often when we say multifamily housing, we have an image in our head. There's a lot of different types of housing that fall between a detached single-family home and a mid-rise or high-rise, and any of those would qualify as multifamily. So the regulation itself, the statutory requirements of Chapter 48, Section 3A are listed here. This applies to all communities served by the MBTA. They must zone to allow for multifamily housing as of right, which I'll go into all of the details about each of these pieces. And there's a greater obligation for communities with better access to transit stations. Those benefits will be higher near those transit stations. And this is in contrast to the current extensive process for zoning approvals and special permits that can make it impossible to create the homes that we need. Between 2015 and 2017, only 14% of multifamily units in the greater Boston area were permitted as of right. So that means the other 85% were going through these really lengthy processes and maybe not ever getting built. So as you can see here, the zoning must be allowing multifamily housing as of right. The zones must be of a reasonable size, a minimum density of 15 units per acre. No age restrictions are allowed, and housing must be suitable for families with children. And in addition, the zoning must be within a half mile of the whatever the transit option is that is being applicable. So there are 4 different categories of MBTA communities, and you can see them here. What you need to know here in Milton is that Milton is a rapid transit community. The main takeaway for Milton, and I'll talk about each of these components again. Milton must create and approve an as-of-right zoning district with a capacity of at least 2,461 units of multifamily housing over a minimum of 50 acres, and 50% of that district must be within a half-mile radius of a rail station. So that's what is required for a rapid transit community. So what does as of right mean? As you can see here, it means that you are allowing multifamily housing without the need for a special permit, a variance, a zoning amendment, some other sort of waiver or discretionary approval. You can require site plan review, but it's not allowed to unreasonably delay or impose any sort of conditions that would make it impossible to proceed. And you also can't impose the requirements on multifamily housing that wouldn't be applicable to other uses. So you can't say multifamily housing has to meet these requirements, but single family housing doesn't. Or multifamily housing needs to meet these requirements, but commercial development doesn't. Some examples here, you can't have higher energy efficiency standards, third-party certifications, or a requirement of commercial uses within multifamily. I do want to make a note, you can incentivize these items. For example, you could incentivize commercial use on a ground floor by allowing higher heights and if there's commercial use on the first floor. Or you could provide incentives, financial incentives to create deeper energy efficiency. You just simply can't require it because that can detract from this state regulation that this housing be as of right. So when you start putting additional conditions on, you are taking away that as of right component. Affordability is not explicitly noted in the 3A statutory requirements, but based on a lot of community feedback, DHCD released updated guidelines this past fall with affordability specifically noted in it. So all communities can require up to 10% of affordable units at 80% of area median income in all districts. And this is what we call inclusionary zoning. If you're not familiar with that term, this is where when developers build housing, they include a percentage of the units set aside at an affordable rate. So any community that is creating MBTA zoning can set that 10% of units aside at the 80% of area median income level. There are also exceptions. If you're using a DHCD approved program like 40R or TIF programs, you can go to a higher percentage. And if you would like to go even higher than 10%, you can go up to 20% of the units being set aside as affordable with a feasibility analysis. We don't yet know exactly what the details of a feasibility study will look like, but there are many communities in Massachusetts that require 15% of units be affordable or 20% units be affordable, or they require that the units be affordable to a deeper income level. And they can do that under this zoning as long as they have a feasibility analysis showing that it would not prevent development from moving forward. So that's the affordability side. DHCD is generally requiring that the bulk of this multifamily zoning be located within a transit area, but they're also understanding that some transit areas don't have developable land. They might have protected open spaces, or they might be right near water. And so depending on how much developable land is in the station area, that is how much the community has to zone right near the transit. So again, here in Milton, 50% of your district must be within the station area or a half-mile radius of a transit station. And that's based on how much developable land you have here in Milton. The housing that is, the zoning must allow for housing that is suitable for families with children. And this is explicitly called out in the regulations, so you cannot have zoning that has age restrictions on units. Often communities will say, we want housing, but we don't want the kids that come with it. With the school can't handle more students, so they'll say only housing for people who are 55 and older. You are not allowed to do that in this zoning. And you also can't have legal restrictions on the size of units or number of bedrooms or other things that might make it impossible for families with children to live in the homes. I want to say a couple things about this. First of all, there is no evidence that multifamily housing actually leads to increased school capacity or increased numbers of students in the schools. There's a great study from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council on this. I'm happy to share that with you. But it's also a fair housing violation to zone to keep out a protected class of which families with children are. So this is good practice and also smart for our communities to allow housing that is suitable for families with children. So those are the main requirements. Failure to comply with the multifamily zoning requirements will make the community ineligible for a variety of funds. I want to make a note here that Milton has received $2.8 million, by my count, of funds from these sources since 2011. So it's significant money. MassWorks is the largest one. Communities use that for a lot of infrastructure improvements, transit improvements. And determination of compliance might also inform other funding decisions. So this is part of the regulation, specifically calls out these funding sources, but there are others that might take this into account when at a state level when evaluating applications. So there's a process for determining compliance. Right now, you guys are in interim compliance because you've done all of these steps up till now. By the end of January 31st, Milton will need to have submitted an action plan and then a full district compliance application by the end of December 2023 because you are a rapid transit community. So rapid transit communities have a shorter turnaround on compliance than other communities. And DHCD will be the determiner, and that's the Department of Housing and Community Development, sorry for using acronyms. There is a compliance model that communities can use to determine whether they maybe even have zoning now that complies or what they want to do to change their zoning in order to comply. So you can find this on DHCD's 3A website. You do need GIS software to fully utilize the tool, but there's also a zoning checklist. And you can see that walks users through a bunch of series of questions and prompts to kind of understand the proposed dimensions and components of the zoning that you're thinking about. And that's a good place for community members to start. You don't need GIS to do it. You can look through the checklist and say, do we want to allow a certain height? What's the density we want to allow? The parking minimums or maximums? But I would also urge you to connect with your local planning staff. They are the ones who have all of those shape files they can download, and they are definitely going to be playing around with that compliance model to see where can we tweak, what will this look like for our community. And then ultimately it will spit out a estimate of, after you put in all of your components, what will this actually look like? There is technical assistance available from a bunch of resources through DHCD and through the Massachusetts Housing Partnership. There was a great online series of workshops that MHP put together. If you go to their website, you can check them all out. Some of them speak specifically to affordability, to doing family housing, to what the types of housing might look like in your community. So I would urge you to check that out if you haven't. And your regional planning agency, NAPC, can also offer assistance. So I just want to leave you, before I hand it off to Tim, with kind of what you can be doing now as a community resident, as someone who cares about this. You can definitely be reviewing the guidelines. They are extensive, but the summary that I've given you should give you a jumping off point to understand what you're looking for. You can be thinking about what inputs you want to prioritize locally. So are you looking for more height, more density, more units per lot? Do you want to cut back on parking, which can allow for more housing right near transit? You can be having community conversations about the various benefits of multifamily zoning. So I mentioned all of those studies that are out there. I'm happy to share resources to help you review those. You can review your local plans to see how zoning can help you meet your needs. So you have master plans, housing production plans, fair housing plans. Zoning is a tool that can help you to meet your needs. So if your master plan says we want to create more affordable housing opportunities, or we want to reduce our dependency on cars, think about how the zoning changes that you're proposing might help you to meet those goals. And definitely attend community meetings like this to learn more. But as the process moves forward, as you have proposals, as you have conversations about the types of zoning you want to implement, show up to those community meetings. That's going to be your time to weigh in and have your voice heard. So for more information, this is the mass.gov website on the MBTA Communities Guidelines. They also have a great email address. If you email them, they will get back to people with questions. I know they're hearing from a lot of communities right now. And of course, feel free to reach out to me. This is my email address. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I think we're going to hand it off now.
Thank you very much, Dana. I wanted to mention a few things. There is a pointer to this same location from the town's website, where you can basically go to the town's website, go to the public planning, and you can find out this link as well if you want to get more information. So thank you, Dana. One other thing, if you came in and you didn't fill the sign-in sheet and you'd like to, we really welcome you to do that. It's right over there on a pink clipboard right by that table. So next up is Tim Zerwinski. He's our Director of Planning and Community Development in the town of Milton. He's worked here since 2020. He previously worked as a Senior Project Manager in Development Review at the Boston Planning and Development Agency. He has a Bachelor's in English from Boston College, as well as a Master in Urban Planning degree from Harvard University. Please welcome Tim Zerwinski.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? I'll try to project. So as Robert said, I'm Tim Zerwinski. I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development. This first slide is what it's all about. This is the Mattapan trolley coming into Milton Station. Milton is a rapid transit community. That means we have train tracks that feed into the MBTA subway system. Contrary to that little 2-minute that you see on the board, we haven't seen too many of those recently, but we're gonna hope the T gets its act together soon enough, and we get some good service out of the T. So Dana did a great overview of the MBTA Communities Law, Section 3A of Chapter 40A. Just as a refresher, if you forgot in the last 5 minutes, 15 units per acre, not more than a half a mile from a commuter rail station, subway station, ferry terminal, or bus station, no age restrictions, suitable for families with children. And then the statutorily defined grant programs that you either retain or lose eligibility for are MassWorks Housing Choice Local Capital Projects Fund. We'll go a little bit into how Milton has benefited or not benefited from those programs in a little bit. I'm here to talk a little bit about the local context of this and some of the local planning efforts that we've begun to engage in around this really very consequential and dramatic piece of legislation that was passed by the legislature. So the options for compliance are you create a new district, you amend an existing district, you create an overlay district. But as Dana said, compliance means multifamily by right and a density of 15 units per acre with no age restrictions. So the question is, first off, do we have any compliant districts in the town of Milton today? The answer is no. The overwhelming majority of land in Milton is zoned for single-family housing, so that's 1 unit per parcel. Most everyone here either lives in a single-family house or knows someone who lives in a single-family house. It's the predominant built form in the town of Milton. Something like between, now I'm getting my statistics, between 75% and 85% of our homes are in single-family homes. Where we do allow and have allowed townhouse and multifamily development, it's through a special permit process. How many people are a town meeting member? Awesome, I love it. So if you've been a town meeting member for more than a year or two, you've been involved in a rezoning conversation at town meeting. That's how we do things in Milton. The base is single family, and if the property owner wants to do something else, we go to town meeting and we get new zoning, usually under a planned unit development, which means, when we say overlay, that table is the zoning and the overlay is the tablecloth that you put over it. And you can use the table or you can use the tablecloth. I'm not going to torture that analogy too much more. But it's sort of a sort of parcel or sort of small district specific piece of zoning that says you can do something different than a single family house. Walcott Woods on Upper Canton Ave, Woodmere on Brush Hill Road, 88 Wharf, 131 Elliott Street, 36 Central Ave were all permitted through a special permit process that was the result of rezoning at town meeting. And then a lot of our multifamily development is age restricted. So Unquity House, Winter Valley, Fuller Village. These are relatively large multifamily housing developments, but they are age restricted. And so because there is a not by right zoning entitlement process, and because it is age restricted, none of those districts count. And I use that term in quotes and loosely because what counts is a little convoluted, but we'll figure it out together. If we did have a district where multifamily housing was allowed by right, we would be able to take the number of units that are zoned in that district and subtract it from our zone capacity requirement of 2,461 units. But again, like I said, we don't have that. That map, I wish, Milton's a funny shape because it doesn't work for slides. I like north to be up, so I always have a kind of not very big map of Milton. But these are some of those planned unit development and overlay district areas that I referred to. So this is really the only places in town where we have allowed multifamily development. Everything else, a lot of it is obviously the Blue Hills, but everything else in yellow is zoned for single family. So this is just another way to visualize and think about the information from the previous slide. So we're going to have to come up with a new zoning district, and quite frankly, probably multiple zoning districts for reasons that we can get into a little bit later. But as Dana went through, the effects of noncompliance, as defined in the statute, are the town loses eligibility for 3 grant programs. Housing Choice Initiative, which is a program that's relatively recent, that was really meant to incentivize housing production. So it's kind of one of these things where if you start to win, you keep winning. If you meet certain thresholds of housing production, you become eligible for grant programs, you get to the front of the line on other grant programs. It's sort of a way to incentivize housing production. And these are not just housing grants, these are infrastructure grants, and open space grants, land agglomeration grants. MassWorks is one that folks may be a little bit more familiar with. This is an infrastructure grant program. It's 12 or 13 years old. It's the state's main kind of infrastructure kind of promotion grant. These are projects that are meant to enable and promote economic development. So when the MassWorks grant that we got maybe 10 or 11 or 12 years ago was in conjunction with one of those rezoning efforts to create the Central Ave Milton Village planned unit development area. This is the zoning that enabled 88 Wharf and some of the other projects down there. In conjunction with that, we got a MassWorks grant to do streetscape and infrastructure improvements on Elliott Street, which is sort of the connector between those two districts. So that's the last big MassWorks grant that we've gotten. We haven't really been a player in that game for quite some time. And then the Local Capital Projects Fund, which I'll get to in a slide coming up. And again, as Dana mentioned, there's other grant programs that the state has that are, as of now, unknown to us, that the state may, in its discretion, use compliance as a metric for whether or not the town will be eligible for grants. So MassWorks, and this is kind of the sort of state description of the MassWorks program. Competitive grant program provides the largest and most flexible source of capital funds to municipalities and other eligible public entities, primarily for public infrastructure projects that support and accelerate housing production, spur private development, and create jobs throughout the Commonwealth. Pipes, sidewalks, streets, train tracks, bus lanes, et cetera, et cetera. These are the types of things that MassWorks pays for. It varies, between half of, not half, 60, 60, $55 million annually. That number has kind of ticked up recently. Those are the two grants that we've gotten. That first one was for a project in Milton, obviously, Hope Pond. But the town was not the applicant for that. It was DHCD that was the applicant, or not DHCD, DCR, excuse me. It was the applicant for that one. But similar sized towns to Milton have averaged 2 awards worth $2.2 million since 2011. So, we're a little bit behind that. Like I said, we haven't really been a player in the MassWorks game, but, you folks live here and you can kind of make a judgment as to whether or not it would be handy to have a couple $1 million every few years for infrastructure projects. The housing choice grants, we haven't been eligible for that, and so that hasn't really been a factor for Milton. Although, if and when the 40B projects that we've approved recently come online, we may begin to start meeting the threshold for housing choice compliance, which may make us eligible for those grants. But the Local Capital Projects Fund, and we'll go a little deep in the weeds here, because this is one that's probably the most obscure out of these grant programs. And I'll say in the sort of the municipal planning community, when this legislation came out, everyone was kind of like, Local Capital Projects Fund. This is relatively recent, 2012, or whenever we passed the casino bill that enabled the Encore and the Plainville and the Springfield casinos. A portion of that casino revenue goes to the state and goes into this Local Capital Projects Fund. Unlike MassWorks or Housing Choice, this is not a competitive application-based grant. This is a pot of money that the legislature appropriates on an annual basis. And what they've been doing for the past at least 4 or 5 fiscal years, and perhaps more, except the way that they report the budgets back then is a little bit different, has been going towards subsidies for public housing authorities. So the way that the state has been doing it, and this is, subsidy to a public housing authority means housing authorities have 3 sources of revenue primarily. Rents, which is the smallest one because these are people that are not paying a lot of rent to public housing. Federal funding from housing and urban development, and then state subsidies are the 2 sort of big chunks of housing authority money. Between fiscal 20 and fiscal 23, between 9.7 and 10.6% of all of the money that the state puts into public housing authority subsidies has come from the Local Capital Projects Fund. So the way that DHCD has kind of expressed it to us is, if you're not compliant, your public housing authority needs to figure out where they're going to come up with more or less 10% of their budget. There have already been 6 non-compliant communities that have gotten a pretty sternly worded letter from DHCD expressing just that. That in fiscal 23, 10.6% of public housing subsidies from the state came from local capital projects. You're not eligible for local capital projects. That's it. Just for our own kind of local information, in this period between 2018 and 23, between $235,000 and $255,000 in state subsidy money has come in to the Milton Housing Authority. So, 10% of that on an annual basis is at risk with non-compliance. So, this legislation passed at the so in January of 2021 is when this law came out. Everyone very kind of anxious to see the guidelines because the legislation is actually, if it's 10 lines, that's how long it is. So it doesn't have a lot of detail to it. So we were really kind of looking for DHCD's guidelines for what does compliance mean for these communities. And basically what they did was they set up a sort of interim compliance period, and then the ultimate compliance is have you passed zoning or not. The first interim compliance step was, 1, your planning director has to brief your select board on the guidelines, which we did back in March. And 2, you have to submit an information form, which is basically like, who are you, where are you, how many housing units do you have? It's 1 page worth of form. We did that very easily, so we are compliant for 2022. The interim compliance step for 2023 is, as Dana mentioned, is the action plan. And the action plan is a form that DHCD has put together that basically wants a little bit more information about, what does your current zoning look like? What is your timeline for achieving compliance? So that's public outreach, drafting zoning, public hearings, town meeting. And then they want to have an idea of, where are you at this point in time thinking about where your zoning districts will be. So we've had a conversation at the planning board, kind of walking through this action plan. I got some feedback from the planning board. We'll be sort of updating our draft for further consideration by the planning board in January. Ultimately, what I'm looking at is to go to the select board at the end of January to get the okay to submit this thing to DHCD so that we can be compliant for 2023. So that draft is still being drafted. Some of the technical assistance resources that Dana mentioned in her presentation, we have aggressively availed ourselves of. That 65,000 actually should be 50,000. I counted another thing for another piece of money that we got for something else. But we do have $50,000 in state grant money to help us with this, and it's really very open-ended. The way that the planning board has kind of approached this is there's a lot of questions that we have that really need to be answered before we can intelligently start to think about what this zoning district would look like. So, impacts on police and fire, impacts on the schools, impacts on infrastructure. What is it going to look like? What is a reasonable expectation for build-out under zoning that we may produce? So we're putting together a scope of work for consultant services to get some professional help to help us answer some of those questions. These are some of the priorities: build-out analysis, potential municipal impacts, and then help with community outreach. I love coming out here to meetings like this. I love the planning board. We're going to want to have help with a plan to sort of reach as many people as we can to get input and feedback on these efforts. We've also secured up to $20,000 in technical assistance from the Massachusetts Housing Partnership. This technical assistance program is more focused on the actual sort of technical drafting of zoning. So the way I'm thinking about this is, we've got one pot of money that's going to help us answer a lot of questions, and then we've got another pot of money, to get professional help to do the actual kind of, drafting of zoning language. And then, again, this compliance model is actually a pretty innovative and powerful tool that DHCD has created. That it's not as simple as this; it never is. But in simple terms, you sort of draw the line around whatever district you're kind of thinking about, and it'll tell you, is this compliant or is it not? Because you do have to hit those metrics. It's got to be 15 units per acre. It's got to be at least 50 acres, and it's got to have a zone capacity of 2461. So we'll be able to use that tool ourselves, but we're also going to get professional help with kind of running through it a little bit. So to end, I wanted to talk through some of the planning goals that the town has as memorialized in some of its planning documents. There's a lot of concern about the impacts of multifamily zoning, which are understandable and valid. And there's a lot of concern about what are the consequences of non-compliance going to be, and those are important as well. I want to take every opportunity I can to focus on the potential opportunities for improving the town of Milton through multifamily zoning. And so if you look through the master plan has a ton about housing and economic development and things like that, but there are a few really relevant goals and objectives in the master plan that this MBTA community legislation could help us increase and expand the range of housing types. This is a theme throughout all of our planning documents. And as I said earlier, the predominant housing type in the town of Milton is single-family house. It is the most expensive housing type. You can not afford to live in the town of Milton if you make less than, I don't, you know, the numbers are astronomical. You know, the typical sale between, in the last year in the town of Milton has been almost $1 million for a single family house. It's not tenable if we want to have a community where people can raise their families, where their kids can live, you know, in the town of Milton. And we can actually have people living in our town that actually work in our town. And so the range of housing types becomes really important. So not just single family houses, but apartments, townhouses, accessory dwelling units. It's all needs to be on the table. And this is in the master plan. So multifamily units created under MBTA community zoning will invariably be smaller than the typical single family house. That's how multifamily housing works. You know, there's small houses and there's big apartments, but on the whole, a unit in an apartment building is going to be smaller than a unit on a single family lot. Increased market rate and subsidized housing for the elderly. So there are no age restriction. You can't do age restricted housing under MBTA communities. But one of the things we hear when we do housing planning, when we reach out to anybody, when we talk to Council on Aging, when we talk to our friends at MRE, when we talk to our friends at the Housing Authority, it's people getting older, their kids are moving out of the house, they're on a fixed income, and they want to stay in their community, but they can't afford to live in their enormous house. There are no options for these people. You know, the waiting list to get into subsidized elderly housing in the town of Milton is extraordinarily long. So even though we can't build age-restricted housing under MBTA communities, what we can build is those smaller units that provide options for people to get out of a larger house, get into a smaller multifamily unit, and open up that house for a family that's trying to get into Milton that may be priced out right now. The housing production plan, and these will be similar kind of points that are made in the master plan because these are just consistent and chronic throughout the town. The priority housing needs say that we need a greater diversity of housing stock. So the housing production plan wants us to build 250 affordable units over the next 5 years from 2020 to 2025. You can't build affordable units under single family zoning. You can't. You can't. No one would do it. The amount of subsidy involved in deed-restricted affordable housing is, again, astronomical. And the only way that it's ever done is through multifamily housing production. This is why, with very, very rare exceptions, when you see a 40B project, it's not a single-family subdivision. It is a multifamily building. Because you need to have that number of market rate units to internally subsidize the affordable units. Because again, the strict economics of it are, a market rate unit is paying 100% of the price, an affordable unit is paying a fraction of that price. And so you've got to make up that income if you're a developer somewhere else. So if we want to have deed restricted affordable housing in the town of Milton, it's got to be in the context of a multifamily building. And you need to zone for that. Rental development goal of 85% of all new units created. The housing production plan wants us to build rental housing. Again, very rarely do you see rental housing in a single family context. It's not impossible, it never happens, but it's very rare. And then half of rental units produced directed to seniors or single individuals. The same point as before. We can't do age-restricted housing, but we can do housing that is going to be more available to people on fixed incomes, on lower incomes, who are looking for a smaller housing situation. The final report of the Equity and Justice for All Advisory Committee, which came out earlier this year, that report was very, very much concerned with deed-restricted affordable housing. And so again, you know, there is that opportunity under this to create inclusionary zoning units. You know, the guidelines allow for a 10% inclusionary requirement. That will keep us above water on 40B. You can't build those units unless you're building multifamily housing. And the MBTA communities legislation is designed to increase housing supply region-wide with the goal of stabilizing rents and prices. And this is something that, you know, the reason why this is coming down from the state is because the state sees a regional and statewide housing crisis that every community needs to do its part to help ameliorate. for the benefit of the entire region, of the entire Commonwealth. And there's an economics 101 component to this where there's extraordinary demand for housing and supply doesn't keep up. That's when prices go up. And so, this is really what MBTA Communities is about, is to build more housing, to modulate the prices, and to meet the demand for all the people that want to live, here in the Commonwealth. And we have ongoing climate change and sustainability planning. We're in the process of getting the scope of work out for a climate action plan. In conjunction with the engineering department, we're doing a lot of work on climate change and sustainability. Transportation emissions are the #1 contributor to greenhouse gases in the United States. This is another thing that Dana was talking about. When you have walkable communities, when you have communities, the more people you put closer to transit, closer to amenities, the fewer vehicle miles traveled you have. We're not saying that people are going to get rid of their cars and live in a walkable utopia, but the closer you are to stuff, the shorter your trips are and the fewer greenhouse gas emissions that you're creating. And then households in denser and more walkable neighborhoods have a lower carbon footprint than households in single-family neighborhoods. And this has been demonstrated most recently this week. These are diagrams that came out of a New York Times partnership with University of California. They did a census tract by census tract evaluation of households' carbon footprint, effectively. And so here we've got Greater Boston, and so green is good and dark orange is bad. And this is by tons of CO2 per household. And so you see when you get into downtown Boston, Brookline, Jamaica Plain, Austin, Brighton, these are the places where transit rich, amenity rich, multifamily rich. And then you see town of Milton, which, aside from our border with Canton, is surrounded by census tracts that are at least average or better than average in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And this has everything to do with land use and the built form. When you have only single-family houses, that means that your community is stretched out farther from transit, from amenities, from jobs. The farther you have to drive, the more greenhouse gases. The bigger your house, the more you have to heat it. The bigger your house, the more stuff you have. These are all contributors to carbon footprint. So, this is something where, town of Milton is not going to prevent sea level rise, but paradoxically, if we do nothing and everyone else does nothing, then, we're all going to be going to work in a canoe one of these days. So, it's dramatic, and it's kind of, maybe seems a little bit kind of far afield from a zoning conversation, but this is how connected land use regulation is to everything. And so, it's going to be a difficult conversation. There's going to be a lot of really, really difficult trade-offs and conversations to be had. But, taking advantage of this opportunity and approaching it in a good faith way really does give us an opportunity to achieve a lot of the plan goals that we have. So that's it for me, and I'll kick it back over to Robert.
All right, so we're going to switch gears a little bit. A lot of information was just shared with you guys, and so now we're going to give you the opportunity to ask questions and hopefully be able to answer them. So Linda and Jeff are going to be doing kind of the moderation of those questions, the Q&A session, but Tim and Dana will answer those questions, but we'll ask that if you have a question, that the person that's answering the question repeat the question so that everyone can hear what that question was. All right?
So we want to thank, I'm Jeff Wilkinson, by the way, one of the co-founders of AIM, and we want to thank Dana and Tim again and emphasize this is an opportunity for all of us to get additional information. We appreciate everybody who has signed in. I'm going to pass this around. If you didn't get a chance to sign in, please do, and we'll keep you in touch. So could we have our first question? Sure.
My name is Webster Collins. I'm in the commercial real estate business, and I'd like to read a quote out of one of the documents that is a fundamental value issue that we're addressing here. But the textbook called Real Estate Handbook, published by Barron's, it's a world-renowned book that I'm going to give you. Definition: homogeneous, uniform of like characteristics of quality. The values of an area tend to be maximized when properties are homogeneous because unusual properties are likely to reduce value for other nearby properties. What you have heard today is the classic government folklore because it has a major impact on a town like Milton. If you take and look what compliance means, it means you take a strip along the Ponset River, some of the highest value real estate in the greater Boston area is right along there, and that gets just destroyed in terms of property value. This article that you are hearing about requires rezoning, and the implication that we've heard tonight is that non-compliance means that we don't get a like $250,000 a year in funds. That's small money for what we're talking about in terms of the risks that we are placing this town in.
Thank you very much. Do you have a question?
I don't have a question, I have a
Okay.
statement.
So,
And I'm going to leave right after this statement so others can have questions.
thanks. Well, we're hoping to let people
But
ask questions while we have
But
these
the truth of what
resources.
we're seeing tonight is you're not hearing the true end of how the real estate world really works.
Thank you very much.
We lose nothing by not doing nothing.
Thank you. Sir,
I tend to agree with the speaker that just spoke. A couple of questions. Does the city of Boston have to comply with this? Do they have it as well?
So they don't, and that's kind of a quirk of state law in the sense that, so there are 351 cities and towns in the Commonwealth. 350 of them are covered by Chapter 40A, which this, it's not up there anymore, is an amendment and an addition to Chapter 40A. So Boston has its own zoning enabling legislation, so it doesn't have to do.
I find that crazy, first of all, right? Because they're the ones coming up with this bylaw and then telling us to comply with it. Secondly, how, under the current statute, does MBTA, and this is the same MBTA, going to fix a step in the station, right, the last 12, 15 years. 20 steps, they can't repair that for us, they use it? Anyway, that's a side note. So if we look at the overall building plan we have laid out, 15 units per acre, how many have to be affordable?
0.
Could you repeat the question?
Now, let me give you like.
Yeah, what's the
So
question?
the question that he was just asking, I just want to make it clarifying quick. It's not Boston that's enabling this, that has created this legislation, it's the state legislature. And it applies to 175 communities. But the question is how many are required to be affordable? 0.
So this does nothing to help our affordable stock, only increase density. I moved out of South Boston because I didn't want dense. I wanted suburban life. That's why I'm here. I had the good fortune of purchasing a rather large piece of property up in the Ponce Valley, in the Ponce River area. I got 7 phone calls from developers, 6 of which were national developers, not even located in our town, laughing at this zone. Because they wanted to come in, it was 3 buildable acres, they wanted to come in and put in 50 units. 50 units. They were laughing because it's no market, it's all market rate. They were going to make a fortune. Can anyone see this? This is a boom for the developers, not for the people. That's a real-life example. I'm not making that up. I have the names of the national developers, everything. More than happy to bring them in here, and they can explain to you how embarrassing this bill is. Embarrassing. We have 9,400 homes in Milton, 17% rents. 17%. The city of Boston's at 30. So we're halfway there to the city of Boston. We should not be compared to the city of Boston. We're a rural town. So 95 homes, if you're saying we're going to lose $233,000 a year, which I think is false, because by my math, it's only $30,000. Right? You had one bill for $1.8 billion 10 years ago, another one for $1 million that wasn't even applied for by the town. So the real risk is 10% of that mass housing bill, right? So it's about $30,000. 9,500 houses. Tell anyone to pony up another $10 a year.
So
You're gonna
can
be triple
I
that.
just want to restate your question. We are recording, and hopefully Milton Cable
Excellent.
Access will be broadcasting the forum. So if I can try to paraphrase your question, can either of you speak to the concern that the lack of a mandate for affordability in the law is a paradox, and how do we rationalize that? Is that a close?
That's a very fair,
Okay.
yeah, absolutely,
Let's
great
start with
representation of my
that.
question.
So a couple of things. One, the zoning is up to you, right? You guys decide what zoning you want to pass with some parameters that are given to you by the state legislation. Under that, you are allowed to require 10% affordable housing. So I would say, if affordability is something you guys are concerned about in Milton, pass zoning that requires that 10% minimum. You also can go above and beyond that. You can go up to 20%. If you strongly believe there's a need for that here in Milton and that's one of your goals to achieve, you can go above and beyond that with a feasibility analysis. And on top of that, what I would say is, Tim was speaking to this about affordability. Certainly, it's not the only way that we achieve affordability, but we don't get affordability when we don't create any more housing. And so adding more housing to the stock, requiring that at least 10% of it or maybe even more of it be affordable, that's how we start to make a dent in our affordability concerns. And smaller units are going to be more affordable than larger units. So there's a couple of pieces there that I think are important to keep in mind.
So,
Tim,
follow-up question.
You want to add to the answer?
Let's hear the follow-up question.
Okay, so we're actually calculating affordability or affordability housing stock in the town of Milton. We calculate, obviously, the affordable housing units that we have. What is not calculating that? Because I was told senior housing that's affordable is not calculating that. I was told that Section 8 housing is not certificates is not calculating that. Because a lot of the renters in this town, and I know a lot of people that own rental housing, accept Section 8 housing certificates.
Right.
Why couldn't we increase that opportunity for people?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. We certainly
So
are.
we want to restate the question.
Restate the question, is what is counted
Yes.
under affordable housing and
Please.
why are rental vouchers not counted towards that? So what is counted as affordable housing is anything that is deed restricted. So I don't know specifically what senior housing you're talking about, but if it has a restriction saying you can't earn more than a certain amount and the rent or the sales price is set at a restricted amount, that would be counted on your subsidized housing inventory. And in addition, when you do 40B developments, if they're rental, all of those units get counted on your subsidized housing inventory, affordable or not. Rental vouchers do not count towards an affordable housing inventory because they can move, right? Someone may use it in Milton this year, they might move to Boston next year, they might move to Florida the year after. But we are advocating for additional rental vouchers. Those two things go hand in hand. So I encourage you to support those efforts. But people can't use their vouchers if they can't find a place to use it. They can't find a place to rent that meets their family's needs, that's near transit, that's near all of the amenities they need. So those two things do go hand in hand.
I heard another question, which I think is a really important one, and I appreciate your pressing the point. What is our financial exposure for non-compliance? There's some dispute about figures that we're talking about. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah, so there's the 3 grant programs, so MassWorks, Housing Choice, and local capital projects. So Housing Choice is out. We've never gotten Housing Choice money. We have gotten, so there's been almost $3 million of MassWorks money spent in town of Milton across 2 grants. One of them was for improvements to Hogan's Pond. One of them was for improvements to Elliott Street between Central Ave and Adams Street. And then the other ongoing exposure that we have is through the Local Capital Projects Fund, which provides between 9.5% to 10.5% of the state subsidy portion of the Milton Housing Authority budget, which over the past 5 fiscal years would amount to between $25,000 and $35,000 a year. There are other concerns here about noncompliance. The guidelines themselves, as Dana mentioned in her presentation, say that there are other state grant programs that may take compliance into consideration. We don't know what those are. We don't know if, when, how the state is gonna act on those things. But the thing to remember about the MBTA community's legislation is that the legislation starts with every MBTA community shall have a zoning district. And we have lawyers in the room that will tell you that may and shall are two very different things. And it's significant because we won't know until 2024 what the impact of that outside of the legislation is going to be. And the reason I say that is there's two reasons. If a town doesn't have a compliant zoning district, they are in contravention of state law, all right? Period. It says shall, and if you don't have it, you don't have it. So what are the consequences of that? There was an op-ed in Commonwealth Magazine this week, and then a letter in the Globe this morning from a group called Lawyers for Civil Rights. This is a state and regional civil rights advocacy kind of legal group, basically promising that we will go out and sue non-compliant communities for fair housing violations because exclusionary zoning has a disparate impact on protected classes that are protected under the Federal Fair Housing Act. The other bit of speculation that I've heard is a kind of a judicial kind of path where, you know, sorry, I don't want to pick on your house, but you've had developers call you. You know, if we're a non-compliant community and you decide to sell your house to one of those developers, and we don't have zoning that allows them to build at a density of 15 units per acre, they could potentially take action against the town, and with the claim that, look, the town is obligated to have zoning that allows me to build at 15 units per acre, and they don't. The term is called a builder's remedy. 40B is a type of a builder's remedy, where we don't have zoning that allows you to build multifamily housing. We don't have zoning that allows you to build affordable housing, so you go and get a comprehensive permit to allow you to do that. I don't know how reliable that is. I don't know if the courts would take that action, but it's something that, you know, I have heard planners and attorneys and developers speculate about as this is how we're going to approach non-compliant communities. So there's still a lot of unknowns out there, and I think we owe it to ourselves to at least have this good faith conversation about how we could potentially move forward with compliance.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I have a couple of questions and a comment. I'm actually disappointed that DHCD isn't requiring affordability in these plans, and wanted to know if Milton is going to require affordability at least 10%, if we're leaning towards that or not.
You tell me.
Let me just pause, and we'll get an answer to that question, and we'll take your next question.
Okay.
So the question is Milton planning to require at least 10% affordable housing?
I'm being flip a little bit when I say you tell me, but it is up to the town. If that's a priority,
right.
If that's a priority for town meeting, then the zoning will have a 10% inclusionary requirement.
But is that something that the planning board, I mean, you know, I know they have to go through the select board.
I can't speak for the planning board. I can't imagine that they would come out against an inclusionary zoning requirement. They've put inclusionary zoning into their special permit zoning in the past.
Yeah,
it's a clear priority for everybody. One reason I want to get at kind of why DHCD seem to take a little bit of a less aggressive approach towards affordable housing. One thing that you see in a lot of communities is weaponizing inclusionary zoning to prevent development. And the sort of the form that takes is you have a zoning bylaw that says we want 33% affordable housing in any multifamily development, which is really great, until you sort of sit down and do the math on how you actually build the thing between land prices, construction, materials, permitting, and then you've got to internally subsidize 33% of those lower rent units. All of a sudden, you don't have a project. So inclusionary zoning works on a percentage basis. So 10% of 100 units is 10, 33% of 1 million units, or no, 0 units.
Zero
So sorry.
units.
You could have 1,000,000%, inclusionary requirement, but if you don't build anything, you don't get anything. And so DHCD, in their kind of guidance, has really been trying to walk a line between how can we get affordability, make that an option, and also prevent towns from trying to do an end run around this by doing onerous inclusionary requirements. The other thing that I want to kind of just put out there, and it's something that's going to be important for town meeting to consider, is that if you want to have an inclusionary component, you've got to have enough units that create a whole unit. And so that means you're zoning for buildings that at least have 10 units in them, right? Because if you have 5 units, 10% of 5 units is not a unit, right? And, maybe we can figure out some sort of cash out or whatever. But that means that we're talking, if we want to have an inclusionary requirement, we're talking about what I'll call real apartment buildings. Dana talked about the definition of multifamily housing, which is 3 units and above. And so if we wanted to have zoning that allowed for 3 units, which again is more than exists in Milton today, but you can imagine a housing type that is not dissimilar from what we have in Milton that has 3 units in it. You're not going to be able to get an inclusionary requirement out of that. You need to actually allow for significant amounts of multifamily on a given parcel. And so when we talk about what our priorities are and what our trade-offs are in terms of what's important, on one hand you have what is the least disruptive type of housing type relative to the physical character of the town versus what is the housing type that's going to get us these other benefits like affordable housing. And so it's going to be a really important thing to keep in mind. And I'm not throwing this out there to like stymie any conversation about affordable housing. I think it's actually a crucial conversation. But I want everyone to be clear-eyed about, the smaller the project, the less likelihood you're able to get affordable housing out of it.
Do you have another question?
Yeah, my other question was the target of 2461. I didn't see anything in the regs about, a timeline for that. I mean, that's a lot of units and
Great question. So the question is there any timeline attached to the 2461 unit requirement?
So the timeline is about zoning. So the timeline in Milton is an action plan by the end of January, a compliant zoning district by the end of 2023. Nothing may ever be built under that zoning, and you would still remain compliant because your zoning is compliant. It's about capacity to build that 2,461, if I'm getting the number correct. If we build, we can't build that without the zoning, so that's step one. But the MBTA communities doesn't require any built units by any specific timeline. It's about implementing and adopting the zoning to allow for that capacity.
And then just a comment about, it might be helpful to just say that, we're not losing control of permitting process and, still having control over, issues like parking, architecture, and, that those things are still in place, that, town still has control over those things.
And
that's sort of into
Yeah, so the comment was about sort of, the amount of control that the town has over parking, design, site planning. One important thing is you're still allowed to do site plan review under the MBTA communities legislation. Site plan review is a means by which the planning board reviews projects. Under our bylaw, it's multifamily projects or commercial projects above 800 square feet. And that's about parking and circulation, landscaping, lighting, a lot of the physical aspects of a project that have a sort of a physical impact on the town. Now, you can't use site plan approval to reject a project. So if it meets the zoning, you've got to approve it. But the site plan review process allows you to sort of take a look in a way that if you were to just go get a building permit for a single family house, no one gets to look at that except for the building commissioner, and he issues the permit if you meet the zoning. Site plan review allows the planning board in a public hearing to look at a site plan and say, actually, we think your driveway should be here because it's going to provide, a greater buffer to your neighbor, or we want you to put landscaping here so that, all of the things that you see the planning board do on a regular basis are still in play, for some of these projects, which again would be different and more intensive than the typical single-family zoning that we already have.
Thank you. Great questions. Yes, please.
When I was on asking a panel before about this MBTA communities, I noticed that the DHCD guidelines didn't have anything in there about historic preservation and how that would work with the zoning. So is there a consideration when we do our draft to be putting in some sort of bonus points or some sort of consideration for historic preservation in that district?
So the question was about the legislation and the guidelines don't mention anything about historic preservation. So is there an ability to provide some type of incentive or bonus to incentivize historic preservation?
I don't want to give an answer that isn't fully, I'll check in with DHCD on that. I believe, I know
A couple of months ago, they didn't have an answer to that.
Okay, so that is probably something they're talking about. I mean, the big thing is you can incentivize. Nothing in it says you can't incentivize. And you also can have requirements that are applied evenly. You just can't apply, you can't have requirements that are applied just to multifamily, but not to other types of housing or other types of zoning. So that might be part of your answer, but I'm happy to look into that further for you as well.
Yeah, and so a couple other things. So it's important to remember that Section 3A is an addition to Chapter 40A. It's only about zoning. So demolition delay is in our general bylaws. So that's still, if you're redeveloping a house that is subject to demo delay, the Historic Commission can do that. Local historic districts are outside of zoning. So if we decide to establish a local historic district, all of those restrictions and whatever would still apply. And to Dana's point about incentives, one of the things that they kind of talk about a little bit more explicitly in the guidelines is mixed use and commercial, which they basically said you can't require mixed use, but you can incentivize it, you can allow it. And the way that an incentive would work theoretically is, your zoning has to have a density of 15 units per acre, and you've got to allow an all residential option there. You could say, we'll let you build 20 units per acre if you do mixed use, if that's something that's a priority for the town. And so, we'll definitely want to get some clarity on this, but there's a world in which you can imagine all sorts of other goodies that you incentivize. So you say, you can do 15 units per acre with no questions asked, but you can do 20 units per acre if you preserve this nice house that we think is worthy of preservation.
And just to add on to that, again, back to the affordability question, a lot of communities, they have inclusionary zoning, they also have what's called incentive zoning, incentive affordable housing zoning, where there's incentives to have deeper affordability or more affordability. So again, those are things that you can be talking about. What are your priorities here in Milton that you want to use the zoning to?
Another question. Sir.
Joe Modugno, Precinct 4 Town Meeting member. I'm really not clear still on how we would achieve 2,461 units. We're talking along basically the Elliott Street area, a half a mile away from the line, right? I mean, are we talking clearing neighborhoods, bulldozing single-family houses?
So the question for folks, do you want to read? The question is, how are you going to actually achieve?
How are you going to achieve
the zoning, the
doesn't seem possible to me.
2,461.
Yeah.
So I want to again clarify, it's about zoning for 2,461 units. So there's nothing in the guidelines saying once you zone for it, if you own a single family in a lot and you have to sell that and build 15 units, say you own an acre, you don't have to build 15 units per acre. You have to zone for that capacity. The other piece that you mentioned was, where is this going to be? 50% of the zone has to be within a half mile of a station. The other 50% can be elsewhere. So the capacity for 50% of those units needs to be within a half mile radius of that transit station, and the other 50% can be anywhere within Milton's borders.
So can I just follow up for a minute? So is the strategy of the state here to create an enticement for developers to come in after we agree to the zoning, to begin to offer money to people in single-family neighborhoods to sell their houses, knock them down? We have to create this zoning district with this dense development, right? I mean, we can do, as you said, right, we can do the zoning and then take it from there, but it would seem that that's an incentive, you know. If you rezone, the developers will come, and it seems like it's the doom of some of our finest neighborhoods in Milton and people's homes and residences. And I just don't see how that area could accommodate this without really being kind of catastrophic, and to use a very real word, to the town. I don't see it.
So just to briefly paraphrase, the concern is what happens after the zoning is created? How do you actually build units? And is this you didn't use the word, but I mean kind of a closet intent on the part of the state to incentivize developers to come in and as you put it, destroy some of our finest neighborhoods?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call it I mean, this is the way that housing gets built, all right? With very few exceptions, I don't know everyone in this room, but I can say with confidence that a private sector developer built your house. That's how we build housing. And so I don't think that the state is necessarily being coy about the idea that in order to build housing, we're going to need property owners, whether it's the property owner that's living there now or someone who buys the property for redevelopment purposes, are going to be building housing. So it becomes a really crucial conversation in town of if we need to do this, what's important to us, right? And I talk about the physical character of the community because we don't have any public hearing, we don't have any planning process where we don't hear about how important the physical character of the community is. And so it strikes me as something that we need to be very deliberate about of how can we enable additional units via zoning in a way that is going to be least impactful to the way that the neighborhood looks and feels right now. And you saw that diagram that Dana put up of the spectrum of single-family houses to duplexes to three-deckers to garden apartments to high-rise apartments. These are all the different ways that you can do multifamily housing. Which ones do we want to do? And there are ways to craft dimensional restrictions in zoning that have there's no way that you can say you can't knock down this house if you're going to build a three-family house. By-right zoning allows you to do that. But there are ways to craft zoning that give the best opportunity to preserve the look and feel of the existing neighborhood, and that give people the best chance to say, this is a big single-family house. Can I build a similar-looking house that has more than one unit in it? Can I turn this big house into 3 little houses inside? So, if that's important to people, there are ways to craft zoning around that. Now, there's no doubt that, the point of doing zoning that enables additional units is to get additional units built. So, we say there's no requirement for any units to be built, but the whole point is, you want to see some units built. But the other thing that I want to kind of, and there was a question about the timeline, we don't have full build out under our zoning today, right? I have articles from 1938 in the Milton Gazette talking about creating the A, B, and C zones that say, we've got zoning now that can accommodate 60 to 70,000 Milton residents, which is bananas, because you never hear anyone say that today. And also, we've not even gotten close to that. So, obviously when you create a greater zoning entitlement, it'll probably entice a little bit more development. But I think when we talk about full build out, I don't think you'll ever see full build out. And the point of doing it over a wide geographic area is to really spread out those potential impacts, not just geographically, but in a sort of a timeline. So that rather than having, one situation where 131 Elliott, it's not a great example because it used to be an abandoned factory, but it used to be nothing, and now it's 38 units over the course of a few years. When you zone over a wide geographic area for a relatively low but perhaps greater density, that impact is felt over a great area, over a greater amount of time, rather than acutely in one sort of multifamily area. And again, this is not me trying to put my hand on the scale for one type of development or another, but it's the way zoning works.
Are there other questions? Okay, we're going to take this one next, but before we do, I'm just going to tell you, we're departing from the agenda, the use of time that he originally intended. We do need to end this forum promptly at 8:30 with our agreement with the library. We have to get out of the building so they can close on time. So I think we probably have time for one more question. Is that clipboard, has that clipboard gone around? Does somebody have it? Okay, it's back on the table? No? Okay, so could we, somebody who's got the sign-up sheet, thank you very much. So keep it going, and we can do this again. This is clearly an important topic. There's a lot of interest. There's more interest than we can accommodate with the available time tonight. So we're happy to do it again. We really appreciate your time, and go ahead. I think yours will probably be the last question, but maybe we'll squeeze one more.
Sure, yeah, I sort of a follow-on to a previous question. I have sort of the opposite concern, which is you highlighted a little bit where I think realistically no one's going to sell their single-family home and build a huge high-rise. It's just realistically, I think realistically what you outlined we're not going to, what did you say, reach full build-out? I mean, I think that's what I'm afraid of, is that we have this rezoning that everyone is hysterical about how people are going to, the communities are going to get destroyed, replaced by public housing, from the 50s or something. And realistically, nothing happens. So I guess I wonder, how, is there anything in part of this legislation that precludes that? Like, is the MBTA offering up any of their land that they own or control to help communities develop in a place that is appropriate and transit-oriented? Or, and I mean, I guess I would also wonder, is that a goal of your office to reach full build-out? I know it's very difficult to contemplate where it would all go, and I'm sure there would be a lot of pushback, but I mean, is that a goal that your office has, or are you already assuming that's not going to happen?
So the 828.
To restate the question is the concern that, we want to see housing built under this, and is there a chance that this results in no housing being built, even if there's zoning? What are some of the incentives and tools we can use to actually get the outcome that we want out of this, which is more housing?
So DHCD is going to take a look at whatever zoning we come up with the results of the output of the compliance model, and make a determination about whether the zoning can reasonably expect units to be built out of it. So there's not a lot of tricks that you can pull to have built units not be built. The other thing is, districts don't have to be uniform. So you can have a sub-district that has 3 units on a 7,000-foot lot, and you can have another part of the district that has 50 units on a 40,000-foot lot. It depends on the geography, it depends on the parcelization. We can put districts other places in town that don't have as small of parcels as Elliott Street and other streets around there does. So there are ways to to do this. My office's goal is to write compliant zoning, and zoning that will work for the town. And so that's working with the planning board, with the select board, with town meeting, to be in compliance with state law. That's my goal.
I'll add just, on this idea of, I say this a lot, zoning is one of the tools in the toolkit that we have at our disposal to create the communities that we want and that allow us all to thrive. Without zoning, we can't do a lot of the things that we need. So that's step one, is getting the zoning that allows for the type of development that will meet the needs of our community. On top of that, you can do all kinds of things. You can incentivize, you have funding sources, you could use CPA funds, you could attract nonprofit developers, you could be talking with developers. There are a lot of other things you can be doing to incentivize the development to actually happen once you have the zoning in place. You can't do that, or you can do it, but it's a lengthy, protracted process without the zoning in place. So thank you for raising that question.
Great questions, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for